Hey guys, this is Phil Galfond for BlueFirePoker.com, and today I am going to be doing my first part in what will likely be three-parter. This I recorded about an hour of play, and it was all pretty interesting, so I'd like to get to all of it. So maybe it'll be two or three parts depending on how much I pause, but I just got into the action now because I like to get through as much as we can. I was playing 5-10 no limit, 4 tables. I don't really have reads on anybody at all. I opened up all the tables that were running and started data mining for about an hour before I played, as when I got on the lists. But yeah, I've seen the name McMath around, but I've never played with him. I believe Big T 439 is a friend of mine, but I've never played with him. So my read on him is that he's really cool, and everybody else I really haven't seen. I do have a HUD up from the hands I data mine, but I'm kind of not that proficient at using a HUD right now. I used to use one when I played like 510 through 2550, and when I moved up, I kind of just stopped because the player pool was so small it didn't really help at all. And then just I still have one, so I've been using it when I play 2550. I use it, and I'll be using it to make videos, just because, going in readless, I'll make a lot of mistakes, and the first, 40 minutes of play, I'll be getting reads on people and making mistakes. So I'd rather just get a little bit of information. But like I said, I'm a little bit rusty, so I won't be using it as efficiently as a lot of these guys probably do. So here I'm taking some notes. I like to take notes as much as I can, but admittedly I get lazy during a session when I'm not involved in the hand. I don't usually take too many notes. When I play somebody heads up, I take extensive notes just because I'm involved in every hand. But since I'm making a video and just started out, I'm on my note-taking game. And this is an interesting hand. It's always good to know somebody's leading range. Whenever somebody leads, I note what they had if I'm paying attention. And also, it's really important to note that this player, Sick One Yo, bluff raised the river with top pair, which is not something that everybody's capable of doing. And it's really important, not just on the off chance that I get into a hand with him and he shoves the river over a bet, but also you can kind of learn a little bit about somebody's personality from that, or their poker IQ. Somebody who makes a play like that is going to be more likely to make sophisticated bluffs and probably understands a lot about relative hand strength rather than absolute hand strength, because a lot of people would have an argument like, I don't want to turn a hand this good into a bluff, and then sometimes fold, when if you're folding, it doesn't really matter how good your hand is at all. So that's just something to note, and I will take specific notes like that rather than just general, like bluffs a lot or over aggro type notes, because I think it helps a lot more, and because I think aggression in different spots means different things as far as the player's personality. So not getting into anything yet. I raise Queen 10 and flop a really, really dry board, and just go ahead and c-bet. Pretty standard. I think I could have c-bet a little bit smaller considering his stack size, but not all that big a deal. I've been opening lately to 4x from the small blind, as you see on the top left there. Still not sure how I feel about it. I think that, to be honest, it's not a huge deal. You see I've been opening to 3x from, not in the blinds rather than pot. I used to open the pot, but the games at 5-10, from my limited experience, I've gotten a lot more aggressive lately, specifically pre-flop, and I think that I'm certainly a competent pre-flop player, but I'm not going to be... I don't think I'll have much of a pre-flop edge, if any, on some of the pros at this level. I haven't been playing a ton of 6-max no-limit hold'em. I don't really fully understand the ranges they'll have just because I haven't been playing 5-10. And I would rather see more flops, turns, and rivers, and keep pots smaller pre-flop, because I think that's where a lot of my edge will be. So here on the top left, I raise with sevens. I have 7 of hearts, which is a tiny bit relevant, but not super relevant. It's nice to be able to turn a set without there being a flush on board, and I also do have the backdoor flush draw if that happens to hit. But on a board like this, I think that players will be... It just nails his range. If he has any cards between, any two somewhat connected cards between king and a 6, he has a gutter or better. And I'm not going to fold him off a gutter, I would assume. And I'm certainly not going to fold him off a better hand than mine. And although, I'm ahead of a gutter, a lot of times what will happen is I'll bet and he'll call, and any number of turn cards will hit that are not a 7 or an 8, and I'll probably check, and he'll likely bet if he doesn't have showdown value either on the turn or the river, and I'm not really comfortable calling a bet with 7s. So I think that it's better to just check here. And, you could look at it as check giving up, but it's not necessarily giving up, because I think that he would check back a lot of hands like a gutter or lower pairs than mine, things like that. So I do get to see another card a decent amount of the time, because I don't think people think that you're going to be check folding a king high board that often. But he does go ahead and bet, so I'll just lay the hand down. On the bottom right, I have kings and raise the button. Standard so far. He 3-bets me, and this is the player that ran the big bluff on the other table. So one thing that is important to me, at least, is against, and should be important to you, is against players that are capable of making that sophisticated bluffs, big bluffs, and are basically aware of relative hand strength and are good hand readers. Deception's a lot more valuable against somebody who just has a decent pre-flop game and decent flop game, and kind of knows what they're doing on the turn river, but doesn't really read hands all that well. Deception's not as important, but deception can gain you a lot of value when you're up against players very observant. So I decided to go ahead and call here. I think my standard is to raise against most people to 4-bet. I probably 4-bet about 60% of the time if I had to put a number on it, but I do go ahead and call. And the reason, another thing is that his 3-bet percentage is pretty low over this sample, which is actually an argument for 4-betting, because he'll be shoving a lot more. He'll have, a lot more strong hands, 10s, ace-jack, things like that in his range. But like I said, I think that given his ability to hand read, I'd rather just call. Obviously a terrible flop for me. When he bets this small, I only lose to an ace or, queens. So I'll certainly call 1. And, reevaluate from there. Blank on the turn. And he's tanking. Here on I'll pause for a second. On the top left, I raise with ace-4, and I'm going to go ahead and c-bet. On the top right, I have ace-10 suited. I would have called had it been folded to me. I'd rather see a flop with this hand than turn it into kind of a pre-flop semi-bluff. But when a player has only 3-bet 2.2% of the time over 100 hands, 3-bets, I'm just going to throw it away. Now on the top left, turn a gutter, and I think I'll be floated on this flop in a blind v blind battle. A decent amount of the time, he'll obviously call with any 5. His pre-flop range is pretty wide, I think, calling in position, even though he's a tighter player pre-flop in general. But with my gutter and overcard and the chance that he's floating, I don't want to really check call to get money from floats, because I'm not that far ahead. So I'd rather just bet and possibly get him off a 5 or a queen or 7s, something like that, or just like 10-9 that could have made it tough for me had I check called the turn. And on the bottom right, he's now bet half pot again. I don't read too much into his bet sizing. I think he could do that with a lot of hands, just because there's not that much left, and this is he can bet 225 and get the rest in on the river pretty comfortably. I think that he's shown that he's capable of bluffing and a tricky player, but in this spot, given his tight 3-betting range pre-flop, I don't think that he's going to have as many 8-9 suited type hands in his range. I don't think he's going to be betting a queen, so he's just going to have a lot of high card hands. I think that, and given that I have 2 kings, it makes things like king 10, king jack less likely. So I think it's pretty likely that he has an ace king, ace queen, ace jack, and just a little bit too likely for me to call another bet. Even with the pot odds I'm getting, the fact that I'm behind a lot, combined with the fact that I'm gonna have a tough decision on the river. I'm not really, if I called, I'm not sure what I would do to a river shove on a blank. So I think I just give up the hand there. It feels a little bit nitty, but I just think he's 3-betting too tight pre-flop for me to do that. So here on the top left, I just call with ace king suited. A couple reasons. One, his fold to 3-bet percentage is pretty high at 78. I believe that's what that stat is. I hope I'm not wrong. And I have the player on the button, I felt like would squeeze a little bit, and McMath might squeeze a little bit too. The other guy doesn't have as large a 3-bet number, but just the games have been so aggressive pre-flop lately, especially with squeezing. From what I gather, that I want to give them an opportunity to squeeze. Although ace king is a good hand to 3-bet and get in pre-flop, I don't like to 3-bet and get called that much, because a lot of players will put you on ace king. That's like the hand in your head that they think you have. So I'd rather just obviously I'll 3-bet this some percentage of the time, maybe half the time, but I'd rather just call with it a decent amount of the time to induce a squeeze, like I did, hopefully. So I'm thinking about sizing here, and I was thinking about making a small 4-bet to something like 275, but I don't think I might be giving McMath too much credit, though I'm sure he's a great player, or a good player, because I've seen him around for a while. I don't really know his thought process at all. But if I were in his shoes, and OMG Clay can 4-bet to something like 275, I would expect him to be very strong. The reason is, if I am going to 4-bet bluff, there aren't many hands in my range that call a tight player's early position open that are going to 4-bet and fold. Hands like 7-8 suited, I would just call the 3-bet. Hands like pocket 5s, I would probably just shove rather than make a small 3-bet, or that's what I'd assume he would think, or that I would think. And same with hands like ace-8 suited. I wouldn't want to 3-bet if I called with ace-8 suited initially. I wouldn't want to 3-bet ace-8 suited to, or 4-bet ace-8 suited to like 300 and then fold to a shove, because I might actually occasionally be ahead of like a king-queen, and probably it'd be close to neutral against his range. So with a hand like that, I'd rather just shove, not give him, not let him believe he has fold equity. So because I don't want him to shove some hands that he would. So I think it's best to just go ahead and shove here. That way, it just looks less strong to me, because the only hands that I feel that I would be 3-betting small here or 4-betting small here would be strong hands. And he folds. It's interesting that he took a little while to fold there. Just because I'd figure a lot of the times he'd have a hand that he would be happy to call a shove with, or a hand that's kind of bluffy. But I guess he's merged a little bit there, and assuming he wasn't just wasting time Hollywooding, he might have had a hand like ace-10 off, something like that. So here on the bottom left, I check behind ace-10. I think that betting there is fine. You get a lot of folds, but it's also a flop that people play back at you a lot on. So I thought I'd check. I do have ace-high, so a lot of showdown value. My ace is likely good if I am behind. And I wouldn't want to bet and get check raised because I think I'd be folding the best hand a lot of the time. And you do have to check back some hands. I guess you don't have to, but I like to check back some hands. Otherwise, you're too check raisable. So now when he bets the turn, I go ahead and call. I pick up a gutter. There's a chance that he has like sometimes just random cards like 7-8 that just bet because I check back, even though I think that's unlikely. But there are draws. There are 2 flush draws, open-enders, gutters, things like that. My ace is probably good. My king's almost certainly good. My 10 might be good. I might be good now. And when he bets the river, it's actually kind of a close decision for me, just because I think he would follow through on this river with a lot of his straight draws that missed. But I think that, I don't know, overall against his range, I think it's probably a bad call. I go ahead and fold ace-10 off on the top left under the gun. I think that I'm pretty tight out of position, and I think that is a spot where you're not making too much money by raising, and you're kind of upping. Anytime you play a hand with almost no positive expected value, so close to neutral expected value, which I feel a spot like that is, raising ace-10 off under the gun in a good aggressive 6-max game, you're just upping your variance. So I kind of made it a policy to play a little bit tighter, or I guess a lot tighter, out of position. And if I was giving up a little bit of edge, which I don't think I really am, you could do it for the sake of decreasing variance. So I do go ahead and fold on the bottom left, I believe. On the top right, I flop an open-ender, and I think it's a little bit too draw-heavy a board to raise. I wouldn't want to get 3-bet off draw this strong. There are a lot of draws I can rep, and certainly have some implied odds too. It's a pretty bad turn for me. There's a small chance I could now be dead to a straight. There's also, my 9 is tainted now. Well, 2 of my 9s, or all my 9s are tainted, and 2 of my 4s are tainted, given that they bring flushes. So on the turn, it's kind of a tough spot for me. I was looking at his stats, but I'm, as I said, not very good at that. I'm not sure what I was looking at. I think I was just looking at flop and turn continuation bet percentages, but I don't think I have enough hands to be able to tell much about it. I decided to go ahead and call. I have some implied odds, I believe, and there are a lot of rivers I can represent. I think that he's going to put his hand or range pretty face up on the river. So I just take a river in position. I mean, if you're not calling with a draw like this, then there aren't a ton of draws that you're calling on the turn that aren't already paired or have showdown value, so you're not going to be bluffing that much on the river. If that makes any sense, it'll kind of leave your river betting range when check 2 a little bit too strong. So here he checks, and he took a little while to check, which leads me to believe that he was either considering a bluff, which I think is unlikely given that the boards come off in a way that almost every semi-bluff hit. So I think he was considering a value bet, which to me means he has a pretty strong hand. I'm almost positive he doesn't have a 9. He could have a hand like King 9 or Ace King going for a check raise, but I also think that's pretty unlikely, given I don't think he could have King 9 pre-flop, and so really just Ace King. And I don't think he'd check raise at just a bare 9, so I'm really only worried about Ace King being the only straight I feel like he can have. So I do think he's pretty strong here, a hand like 2 pair, maybe even a set. So I'm kind of considering whether I can push him off a hand like that or not. And again, I don't know a lot about this player. I was considering a small bet. And a small bet I think is okay, because it is really tough for me to be bluffing here. I'd have to be I think it's actually tougher for me to be bluffing with the small bet, just because it's so likely I have showdown value that a lot of people don't bluff small with a hand here, like, I don't know, ace jack, let's say. Even though it'd be tough for me to get to the river with ace jack, or the turn, that is. But let's say I had a hand, with the strength of ace jack. Or, alright, for argument's sake, let's just say ace 10 of diamonds. A lot of people wouldn't bet small with a hand like that and turn it into a bluff because, I don't know, they're worried about, they might just check it down for showdown value. They feel weird betting small because they think that a lot of, most of the better hands will call. And this is a spot where I didn't want to bet small because if I was right about him having a strong hand, like two pair or set, he might just, I don't know the player, I don't know his thought process, but some people that aren't great hand readers might just think, well, he bets small, so maybe he's value betting worse, even though this isn't a spot where I'd value bet worse than two pair, likely. Worse than, like, queen 10, So, or they might just say, well, it's small, so I call, just because I have a big hand. So I thought that if I wanted to get him off his hand, I had to shove, and I felt like my line looks really credible here, just because it's so likely that I either have showdown value or a straight here. It's unlikely. It's really tough for me to have total air on a board like this, even though there are two flush draws. Just a lot of the hands with flush draws in them now have a pair or or a straight. So I think this is a spot where an overbet shove is good, and obviously I'll be doing this with strong hands as well. Here on the bottom right, I called a raise on the button with suited connector. And flop trips, I think I have to go ahead and bet. This is a flop that I'd bet when check to quite a bit, just because it's tough for them to contest. Unfortunately, they fold. And on the top left, I flop middle set. And get bet into. I think that it's kind of a debatable spot. I could go ahead and raise right now, or I could just call. I think that there are a lot of turns that would kill my action if he has a hand like ace 10, whereas he's certainly not folding the flop with any ace, so I at least get one raise out of any ace, probably more. The other thing is that if he doesn't have an ace, even if he improves on the turn with a hand like king jack, if he spikes a jack, it's going to be tough for me to get a lot of value on later streets. So I do go ahead and raise, thinking that, he probably thinks I'm an aggressive player, and we'll have trouble laying down an ace on any street if I just put in a raise right now. This is also a good board to bluff raise, just because of how often they fold, which seems like it should make it not a good board to value raise, but you have to be balanced and you have to capitalize on people realizing that it's a good board to bluff raise. That said, I think it's still close. You hate to lose action with a hand this strong when you're likely very, very far ahead and he doesn't have many outs, but I just went ahead and raised and didn't work out. In general, the board ace-7-5, it's tough for me to have many value hands when I raise. Calling an early position open, I usually won't have like an ace-5 suited or ace-7 suited. Maybe I will, but not that often. And there aren't that many combos of that. And so I'm basically only raising 7-5 suited and sets for value. Maybe some hands like ace-king, ace-queen that I slow played. So it is a spot where if I want to be bluff raising, I want to have some value hands in there too, and so I might as well use my sets for that some of the time. I switched tables here because I think there was a short stack or two at the table, and this is a deep table. I didn't necessarily want to play. I didn't aim to play deep tables rather than regular tables. One way or the other, I just tried to get on whatever tables I could, but I wanted to avoid short stacks because I think they make things a little less interesting. So here with sevens on the top right, I lead. I think that it's a good board to lead for a couple reasons. First of all, this is a board that I'd like to lead with a lot of hands. If I had a hand like Queen Jack, I would likely lead here a decent amount of time, because this is a board that's really tough for pre-flop raisers to have, much of a hand on. It's also a board that pre-flop raisers will check, that he'll check back a lot with. So if he does have a hand like Ace Jack, he'll probably check back, whereas he might actually float this bet or make a play at me. He'll also be checking back with things like Ace 5 or 9-5 suited if he's raising that, King 6 suited, things like that. King 6 would probably bet, maybe like King 4 suited. Hands that are all calling a bet. Basically for balance and for value is the reason I'm betting here, and it's a flop that I'm comfortable putting a lot of money in on if he does make a play at me. So he does go ahead and raise. And I think that playing this hand out of position, if I call, will be pretty tough. I have a strong hand that's in pretty good shape against anything, but I don't have a monster. If he is making a play with, like, whatever, Jack 10, he has 6 outs. I don't really want to let him see it for free. At the same time, I can get value here. If he does have a hand like, 6-8 or 6-7 or 5-7, he could be raising and getting it in. It's a little bit unlikely, but possible. He also could have a hand like Ace-8 or Ace-7 and just not believe me. I wouldn't expect him to have Ace-7 that often, but it's possible. I also don't think he's raising a lot of Jack-Jack, 10-10 type hands. So I'm really only worried about, a couple 2 pairs, sets, straights, but straights are a little less unlikely given that I have 2 7s and, a lower straight is deuce 3. So I go ahead and put in a 3-bet. This is kind of a semi-bluff slash value raise. I'm hoping that I'll be able to get him off of a hand like Jacks some of the time if he went ahead and raised, which I don't think is super likely, but there's a chance that he could. Or like 9s maybe. And I also think that I can get value from all the pair plus straight draws, or get him to float occasionally and then fold to turn. I made it enough so that I'm not really folding on any street. And so he calls, which is kind of unexpected. I'm a little bit worried that he's strong here. But I think that some of the times with a set, he would just shove the flop to, not give me a free gutter or something like that. So now I'm going to bet. I don't think really... If he is floating, I think he doesn't bet all that often when I check. He might some of the time, but he also might have a hand like... just a hand like 5-4 that played weird, or like a... 6-8 that takes a free card. I basically just want to give myself a good chance of taking him off a better hand if he happens to have it, and getting value from worse, and kind of protecting my hand, as there are a lot of overcards. I don't have a monster by any means. I decided to bet 350 because I think that gives me the most... it looks the strongest if he has a big hand, and at the same time will make it tough for him to fold a hand with outs. I know this is a little bit contrived, thinking that I can be bluffing and value betting at the same time, and it is a little bit of a stretch, but he decides to fold, and I'm not really sure what kind of hand he would play like that. I'm hoping it was a hand like pocket 10s, and I'd feel pretty cool, but I think most likely it was maybe like an Ace-8 that got stubborn. You'll notice I haven't been 3-betting light that much. Like I said, I'm trying to see more flops and turns, keep pots smaller, and also I think that players react really well to light 3-bets these days. And 4-bet with a good frequency, call and make plays on flops with a good frequency. Here with deuces, this is not really the same situation as the board with sevens. There are a lot of hands he could have, especially since he's just defending the big blind. So he could have things like king 4 suited, etc., etc. And here on the turn, I don't expect to fold out too much. I don't expect to be good, so I'm just going to go ahead and check fold. He checks it back, and again, I think that he's really, really likely to have a pair, not that likely to fold it, so I'll just give up. On the bottom right, I raised 6-3 suited. It's a little bit loose, but I'm in late position. And I decided to check the flop. I think this is a flop that people don't give pre-flop raisers a lot of credit for, so if I bet, I expect to get check raise bluffed a decent amount. It's also pretty coordinated, so he's very likely to have a pair or draw that he can continue with. So I'd rather check, see if I can't get to showdown, maybe improve to trips or 2-pair, and just play a turn in position. When he bets a 10 turn, I'm just not really in good shape against much. The best I can hope for is like a, I don't know, king queen, but even then I'm not in great shape, so I'll just fold. I think one of the bigger leaks of players at this level is just c-betting blindly with all their hands. You definitely don't want to be super polarized and only be continuation betting your top pair plus hands and your air, because that just makes you super check raisable. But at the same time, you have to check some hands back, otherwise you're too check raisable just because you're betting every hand. So I like to check back, I like to check back more based on positions of people who raised, the players who are in the hand, and the board texture. And obviously the strength of my hand is a little bit important. But essentially boards that I'm afraid of getting moved off the best hand a decent amount of the time, those are boards that I'll check back quite often. Here with Queen 9 off, I'm not entertaining the thought of doing anything. It's not strong enough to call. You could 4-bet, but I'm just going to lay it down. I decided this session that I wasn't going to go too crazy pre-flop, because I kind of expect people to expect me to, given that I'm playing a 5-10 and they probably assumed I was making a video. Alright, so I call a raise with pocket deuces. It flops jack 6-4, all clubs, and I have no club. This is kind of interesting. A lot of the way I played this hand is based on some assumptions I had about the average 5-10 kind of standard player. And if I were playing in a tough heads-up match against a 200-400 or 500-1K, or just somebody playing less tables or being more tricky, this would completely not apply. My assumption when he checks here is that he very likely has a hand that is folding to a bet. So a lot of people just give up on boards that are 3-tone or 1-tone, I guess, monotone, or 3 clubs, however you want to say it. Everything's fine except for the way that I said it. I think he'll be check folding a lot, and I also think that he will be check calling, and when he check calls, I think he'll have a lot of hands like Jack 10, 6-7, basically things like that, pairs without a club. And it's important. I think that a lot of times if he has a hand like Jack 10 with a club, he'll bet. I also think if he has a hand like Ace 10 with a club, either the ace or the 10, he'll bet rather than check call. And if he has a flush, I think he'll bet almost all the time. So it's really important that I don't think he has a club here, because I'm going to go ahead and bet, expecting to pick it up against all of his hands that are just check folding. which, even though I'm likely good against those hands, I'd rather not let him see a free turn. And also, I'm going to be bluffing clubs. If a club hits, I think it's really unlikely that he has a club, given the assumptions I had. And on the bottom right, I'll fold 7-8 to 3-bet. Alright, so the turn's an offsuit deuce, which is obviously the best card in the deck. And my plan changes from bluffing to value betting, of course. So now I think he does have a hand like Jack 10 a lot of the time, weak pair, and I go ahead and just bet big. I think he's usually when somebody raises then checks and you bet, they don't like to give you a lot of credit. So I think that I can make some large bets and get paid off. The river 3 of clubs is pretty interesting, given the assumption that that I made, which is that I don't think he has a club very often. Here on the bottom left, I just didn't bet any street. I didn't think he was folding enough at the time, and I had no equity in the pot. Back to the top left, though. I thought it was really unlikely he had a club, so I think I'm good here most of the time, maybe 85% of the time, maybe 90 even. Probably 85. I can't be that sure of my read. But given that there's a 4 flush, 4 straight, he's going to be really hard pressed to call, even with the hand as strong as Jack 10. He could potentially have like queens without a club and have been just playing tricky pot control on the flop. But even a hand that strong is going to have a really tough time calling. So I was thinking for a while about making a small bet and hoping he makes a hero call, but I decided to go ahead and check. And my read was right that I had the best hand, but and he had pocket nines with no club. I still don't think he was paying off a river bet. I don't know anything about him, but that's not a call that many people make. So here on the bottom left, I'm going to make I believe my first light 3-bet of the video. 6-4 suited is not strong enough to call here out of position, in my opinion, but it's still a pretty decent hand, so I choose it as a 3-bet bluff hand. On the other hand, on the bottom right, King Jack suited is a different situation, as it's very playable. So I'd rather just take a flop with this hand. It's a good flop taking hand, and so I just call. All right, so here the flop is King 4-3, and it's a weird spot, given that a bet doesn't fold out many or any better hands, and doesn't get calls from worse hands. But I just go ahead and bet to protect my hand. This is a board that he's going to be folding a lot, and there's a chance that he calls with like an ace high, and I get to showdown and win. But this is really just kind of a protection bet and a balanced bet. I think that checking kind of turns my hand face up, and even though I'm capable of checking with a whole variety of hands, I don't know if he knows that, and I think he'll put me on a hand like the one I have there. Here on the bottom right, the flop's 10-8-7. I don't have a backdoor flush draw. I decided to check call. I do have a gut shot and 2 overs, but his c-bet percent, it looks like it's only 54% over this many hands, and this isn't a flop that I think people c-bet with a lot of their air. So I think check folding here would have been okay. Might have been the best play, just because I expect him to have a pretty strong hand, and none of my outs are super good. A 9's good, but I'm not getting much money, and a jack is not a good out, and I mean a king's fine, but out of position I don't expect to have much in the way of implied odds, and there's just a lot of turns that I'm going to have to check fold. So I think I actually have to check fold that flop. I think check raising is a good option against somebody who continuation bets way too much, but against a player like McMath that seems to be checking back a decent amount of the time, it's not going to show a profit either. So I think I should have check folded the flop, and I'll certainly check fold the turn. Looks like I was considering a raise, but then realized that'd be stupid. So here with Queen Jack offsuit, I think it's kind of the same situation where I don't really like calling a raise. I think if I had to decide between calling and folding, I'd probably prefer a fold slightly, just because of the chances somebody squeezes behind me. If I was guaranteed no squeeze, I would call this on the button against somebody who's played 30% of their hands over a small sample. But I choose it to 3-bet bluff with. You have to be 3-bet bluffing some percentage of the time. And then on the bottom right, I actually pretty much use the exact same concept. It's a good spot because, everybody knows about squeeze plays, so I'm not going to explain squeeze play, but there's some dead money in the pot. I am on the button. I have a decent hand. Not a decent hand, but a decent hand to play against strong hands that call me. Alright, so I get cold called by this guy out of the big blind, and I have no idea what to think. He's on 3 out of these 4 tables, and probably was on more tables. Yeah, he must be, because I have 600 hands in mind. So he's got to be a regular. If this were a complete unknown at 5-10, you could assume that sometimes they have just a hand like ace-9 and are terrible, but I'm pretty sure he's not a terrible player. So at this point, it's really important to put people on a hand at every point. And at this point, I put him on a hand like, the usual hands to put him on are hands like pocket jacks. Maybe like an ace-queen offsuit. Ace-queen suited, I feel like might just raise, get it in. I think he could occasionally be slow playing a hand like aces or kings, but not super duper likely. So I think the majority of his range is going to be jacks and tens. And I flop nothing, but the flop is ace queen 3. So this is a good flop. If he does have a hand like jacks or tens, this is a good flop for me to continuation bet. If he does have a hand like ace-queen, obviously it's not, but that gets made less likely, as do queens and aces. I don't think he has queens or aces that often. I think queens he just gets in pre-flop. Aces he does usually, but not always. And, there aren't that many combos now. And he could have kings also, but I think that's unlikely. He could also have a hand like king-queen suited, which would be an interesting play by him, but not necessarily bad, given, depending on his assumptions about my range there pre-flop. So I go ahead and continuation bet, and I make it kind of, moderately sized, somewhat small bet, just because I think that's all that's necessary with the stacks the way they are. On the top left, I flop top 2 pair, and Petter continuation bets. So I'll kind of talk about these 2 hands at once. So on the top left with 7-5, I go ahead and decide to check raise. We are deep, and it could get sticky on a lot of different turn cards, but this is a spot where I'd be check raise bluffing quite a bit, and I don't expect him to fold any overpair or any 7. So I don't know. Playing the hand out of position, check calling is fine, but when he bets 60, I think that I don't know anything about his c-bet sizes, but I'd assume that means he's doesn't have a monster. I could be wrong there. So I go ahead and make a check raise. It's kind of just settling in on a size. And I make it pretty big. I guess it's not super big, actually, considering I was looking at his bet size, but actually the pot's a bit bigger than that, so I think that's a pretty standard size. On the bottom right, I turn to 4. I have quote-unquote showdown value, but I don't actually, because I'm never ever good here. But it does give me 5 outs against a hand like ace-king or king-queen or pocket jacks. So I have a decision whether to check and take my free card, hope to improve, or shove. I think that if I check, I'm not going to be able to bluff the river. I think I would opt not to bluff the river if I checked. The majority of the time. I'd do it some percentage of the time, but pretty unlikely. So checking would be giving up on the hand, which is fine. I give myself a free roll kind of at 5 outs. So you're not just, you're not mucking your hand when you check behind and give up. But I think that given my assumptions and like card removal because the ace and the queen on board, I think he has a hand. I think he still can have a hand like jacks or tens and just, be not believing me, thinking my range is really polarized, which it is. And even a hand like king queen or kings here, I think is going to have to fold if I shove. So this is certainly a marginal spot either way, but I decided to go ahead and shove. I don't expect him to think that I'm semi-bluffing that often. Basically, I'd need diamonds or like a 5-6 or a hand like I have, but I don't think people think that I would semi-bluff with a hand like this. So my range looks pretty strong. It's really just a question of how often he has a hand as strong as ace-king or better. Because I think if he somehow has ace-10, he might be able to fold it. I think he should be folding all of his pairs. Everything worse than ace-jack, I think he should be folding. Or worse than ace-10, I should say. And I think that is enough of his range, and, my 5 outs when called, that I can make a shove there. And luckily it worked. On the top left, deuce is a pretty terrible turn. I guess I have, a couple options, or infinite options, when you look at bet size, or I guess not infinite, but quite a bit. I decided to go ahead and bet rather than check, just because I don't really have that strong a hand anymore, and it's a hand I want to protect. If he does have a hand like 8-9 that he's floating with, which is, pretty likely, he has a good amount of equity against my hand, and I'd rather just have him fold that hand than let it get checked through. If I check, I don't know how I'm going to react to a bet. I'd likely call it, but not be happy about it at all, and I'd be put in a really tough position on most rivers. Betting also gives me some flexibility. I could conceivably bluff some rivers. I could bluff a lot of straight rivers or flush rivers, or if there's a flush river, I could actually check raise bluff. That's kind of a PLO type thing with having blockers. Although I guess we're not quite deep enough, but I have blockers to the full house. So I go ahead and bet. I think it's iffy. Occasionally I get called by 6-7, ace-7, sixes that don't believe me, or something like that. But I just kind of like it more than the alternative, which is checking and being in a tough spot. The river's an ace of clubs, and we have less than pot left. A bet by me now would obviously be a bluff. I think given that sometimes I have the best hand, it's pretty unlikely he has a draw, so I don't think he's going to be bluffing that often. So I think he'll have a hand like... I think he'd shove a lot of draws on the turn. So I think he either has, the very unlikely set on the flop return, an overpair, so an overpair to the 7, or a hand like 7-8 that didn't believe me, and I think he'll check pretty much all of those back. So I don't expect to get bluffed off my hand here, so I'm pretty content to just check fold and, pray that I have the best hand. And he checks and head 9s, which makes a lot of sense. I might have been able to take him off that hand on the river, but I can't be too sure that he doesn't have a big hand himself. And I don't know, the draws that were on the flop missed, so I think he might look me up there. King Jack offsuit is a hand that I'm not really ecstatic about calling out of position, so I'd rather just 3-bet it. You can flop when you flop top pair. You're usually pretty good. They're going to be 4-betting ace king a lot of the time. So on a king high flop, you're only behind king queen, or if there's a 10 or a 9 on board, two pair. So flop like this, I'll bet pretty small, which is my bet with pretty much my whole range here. Not a whole lot to say about it, I think. I could consider checking, but I think that looks super suspicious. So I just make the standard bet. There's kind of an argument to betting bigger, so that he would shove with the flush draw rather than call with it. And he probably the optimal bet size would be larger in that spot, given my hand. Just because if he has a pair, he's definitely not folding the flop. But that's a flop that we're both going to miss a good amount of the time, and I'd rather be able to get away with cheaper continuation bets than make more money the few times I do have a hand. So I kind of sacrifice a little bit of EV there for my range. And it's not something I'll do super often, but I think it's right there. So I had a few pre-flop spots here. Ace-5 offsuit's clear fold, obviously. I could 4-bet, but I don't know. I just think people are going to be reacting to it well and expecting me to 4-bet. With threes on the bottom left, I was considering raising, but stack sizes were pretty terrible. Had everybody been like 100 big blinds deep, might be a good spot for me to shove. I think I take him off of hands even as strong as like ace-jack. And if he's 3-betting a hand like eights, I think he might be able to fold it. And just I think people 3-bet from the button, just a really wide range ever since Dave Benefield taught them to. So I think I get a lot of folds there. But being 150 deep or 140-ish deep with the re-raiser and 200 deep with the opener, I can't really raise to I can't shove, and I don't know, I'd just rather not raise a hand. I have a little thing about not getting pushed off the best hand, so I'd feel really terrible if I made a small raise there and shoved and found out he had ace-king or ace-queen, something like that. So here on the top right, the stats say that he's not 3-betting very much, but that's based on a small sample of four-handed play, whereas I have stats on the other tables where he's 3-betting a pretty decent range. But I still go ahead and fold queen-10 off. It's a little bit close. I do like to call a good amount in position, but it's dominated too often by players with high card re-raising range. And here, 7-9 suited, nothing I can do against a short stack. So we're over like 50 minutes, but I'm actually halfway through, or almost halfway through the session. So I think I'll just get to the halfway point or a little further, so this can be 2 videos rather than 2.5. Sorry for the dead time. I kind of expected to have more going on for tabling. I guess I had like 3 hands going on at once at some points and none going on right now. On the top right, 10-8 suited, if he opens, it's a spot where I'd sometimes 3-bet and sometimes just call. It is a hand that likes a big stack to pot ratio, but it's just a hand that plays really well deep, and we're so deep that I'm not really worried about getting a ton of money in preflop, or it's not like a big risk to get a huge chunk of my stack in preflop. He opens to 30, I raise to 100, and we still have 10 times the pot on the flop. When stacks get deeper, hand values change quite a bit, so hands like ace-queen offsuit go way down in value, and hands like 10-8 suited go way up. And I think that's a concept that a lot of people misapply. Not to say that everybody does. Certainly a lot of people know what they're doing, but I think a lot of people overvalue ace queen, ace king offsuit type hands when they're 200 deep. Here with 4 deuce suited, I go ahead and 3-bet in position. It's another one of those hands that I can't call, but has a little bit of playability to it, and 3-betting in position is rarely a mistake unless you're doing it to the point where they can just pick up on it and play back you all the time. So here with 9s on the top right, it's usually a c-bet for me, but I decided to go ahead and check behind. And my reasoning is, this is a board where I think a lot of pre-flop raisers will just give up with a hand like, I don't know, ace-5 or king-10. So I wanted to give the impression that I was doing that and get him to bet the turn with most of his hands. I think a lot of people just bet total air on the turn on a brick when the pre-flop raiser checks back a board like this. It's also a board that I could get check raised on and would hate to fold my 9s. Certainly a standard c-bet for me, but I decided to mix it up. And when he bets half pot on the turn, I have an open ender and pair 9s. Good a decent amount of the time and have outs if not. So it's a pretty easy call for me. And I'll just be happy to check it down. And it looks like I saved money. Or actually, probably the same amount of money gets in either way. So here I get 4-bet, and it's actually kind of a tricky spot for me. I'm a little rusty on 4-bet ranges, but that seems like a big one if he's 4-betting 18%. But to be honest, I completely forget. It's really just a math problem at this point, and I've run a lot of the calculations for spots like this, and it's usually closer to a shove than most people think, but King Jack offsuit plays really poorly against the hands that he's 4-betting for value. So if I do, then I have pretty poor equity most of the time. So I think it's just a fold. A hand like 8-5 suited would be much better in a spot like that. Certainly like ace-deuce suited would be much, much better. So on the bottom left, I flop top 2. And standard continuation bet. And he folds. And on the top right, he leads into me on a board with 2 overs to my 10s. Kind of a weird lead, because I think he'd expect me to continuation bet a board like this all the time. So I do think that he is weak some of the time, but I still don't really have outs to improve if behind. So it's kind of like a slightly ahead, way behind situation. And he's likely going to bet turns, and I'm not really comfortable calling a second barrel. So I think the best play here is just to go ahead and fold. You know, I'd rather call here with a hand like 10-8 than a hand like 10s, even though 10s has some showdown value and half as many outs probably. But I think that's just a fold. Just because with 10-8 you can bluff later. I mean, obviously you could turn your 10s into a bluff, but I can bluff later once I realize that he doesn't have a hand. So I make the same against air usually. I lose a little more against made hands when I bluff, but also I have 4 or 3 outs to the nuts and 4 outs to another out to likely the best hand. But I guess we're halfway through the recorded session, so I'll stop the recording here and start part 2 up. I hope you guys enjoyed it. This is Phil Galfond for BlueFirePoker.com.